As you're logging in, if you could please go to menti.com and use the code 18185034 at the top of the screen and tell me what words come to mind when you hear quantitative data.
Okay, I think we're going to get started now. I'm Ellen Weiss. I'm the Executive Director of SREE, and I want to thank everyone for being here today. We were overwhelmed by the response to our first Researchers of Color Brown Bag. We've had over 300 registrants. Several had mentioned that they wanted to see the session but couldn't attend, so we are recording the session. I noticed that many of you might not be familiar with SREE, and I just wanted to let you know who we are. We're an organization that is dedicated to advancing research relevant to practice from early childhood through post-secondary education. Our members are from students through emeritus and focused on educational research and improvement, and really with a look at the research methods that are used in making sure that it is high quality. Our Researchers of Color group started about 1.5 years ago. Getting it off the ground has been a little bit slower than we would have liked with the pandemic, but we are really excited to be offering our first brown bag today, and we'll be having some programming at our annual meeting this coming September, which is taking place both in person and virtually. I will put some information about that meeting in the chat for you. But I would like to turn it over now to Wendy Castillo, who is one of the founding members of the Research of Color Affinity Group. She is a lecturer at Princeton and also works at the National Urban League. She's going to speak for about 20 to 30 minutes, and then we will open it up for questions and answers. If you have questions along the way, feel free to put them in the chat.
Thank you, Ellen. Thanks, everybody, for coming. I was overwhelmed also by the responses. Really interesting to see your responses to my previous question, which were statistics, objective, rigorous, and evidence. That's the things that come to mind when you think of quantitative evidence, quantitative data, and I look forward to digging into that. So I'm presenting how to QuantCrit, which is a theoretical framework, but more, I want to present the practices and questions of how to actually do it. And this is a paper that was written by me and David Gilborn. So I'll be overviewing the paper during this presentation. So I wanted to start with another question. Have you heard of QuantCrit? And I just want to know what's in the audience. And so for me, QuantCrit, I've always known what it was, but I've never had the words to verbalize it. So when I read about QuantCrit, I was like, yes, this is what I've been looking for. So that was my first introduction to QuantCrit. So it seems like we have a little bit more yeses and nos. As you can tell, I'm a data person, so I always like to look at data, to read the room, to know what's going on. Great, so most of you have, and few of you have not, about 40% looks like. So QuantCrit comes from critical race theory, and I Googled it today just to look at the latest, and this is the first couple of news articles that were on. So critical race theory is a hot topic. And just a quick overview, it's an academic concept that has been around for about 40 years that really started in the legal field, used for legal analysis. But the core idea is that race is a social construct, and that race is just not a product of individual biases, but it is a product of the legal system and policies which also have biases and prejudice. That's basically what critical race theory is. The aims of QuantCrit are to take it one step further and center it on numbers and examine how numbers are used to disguise racism and protect the status quo, which is a position of white supremacy. And they provide us, researchers, policymakers, practitioners, with a framework to guide our decisions. And I put the 3 pictures of those whose article I am citing. David Gilborn to my left is my co-author, and these are his co-authors for the paper where QuantCrit was formally presented. One of them, there's been lots of papers. And I always just think it's important to look at who's the one writing it. So here we have this paper written by 3 men, and I think it's just important to always have those things in mind. And it's important to really think about street race. The street race is a sociological concept that talks about how the race that you are viewed from on the street. So you can see here, the street race of these people are 2 white men and a person of color. So just a quick overview of what QuantCrit is. It's basically the idea, challenging the idea that the media and policymakers treat quantitative material as if it's fundamentally different or superior to qualitative data. But it's saying that no numbers are no more obvious, they're not neutral than any other form of data because they're socially constructed in the same way that qualitative data is constructed. So basically, numbers are tools, they are not truth, is what QuantCrit is saying. And the principles that I'm going to go through are these 5 principles. Centrality of racism, numbers are not neutral, categories are neither neutral nor given, for race, read racism, voice and insight, data cannot speak for itself, and social justice orientation. So I'm going to go through each of these principles and think about how we can put those into practice. I'm going to do this by giving you the perspective of the recommendations that I think researchers should take, as well as the recommendations of consumers of research. So a lot of us aren't actually, creating the research or collecting the research or doing the interpretation, but we do consume the research and we should be knowledgeable consumers. So for the first principle, it's the centrality of racism, which is, one of the core principles of critical race theory. And for this principle, when I think about what does that look like in practice, it looks like a positionality statement. And a positionality statement, most of you have probably heard of, is very common in qualitative research, but it's very rare in quantitative studies. And I think that's a powerful reminder of how quantitative studies hide behind this lens of objectivity about the fact that our histories, our identities, our experiences don't impact the way we do research. And when you write a positionality statement, it's about you reflecting on your research and the potential biases and blind spots that you have. And it's not just about, I created the positionality statement, check. It's always an active process with you and your team and maybe people not outside your team, but it shouldn't be just like a token paragraph that you complete and, I did it, therefore I'm using QuantCrit, which is the fear that I have when people say, oh, I used it, I did a positionality statement. So with that said, I want to know how many of you have ever seen a positionality statement in a quant paper? Oh, wow, yes. I've never seen one. Until recently, I have never seen one. And I also really love the data visualization graphics here. Looks like over 75%. have not seen one. And honestly, I hadn't seen one until I did a review recently and the person did a positionality statement. Usually in quantitative work, that is the first thing to go. So I would love to talk to those 18 people and see which paper it was. That'd be very interesting. But I wanted to share my positionality statement and what that can look like. And it's obviously going to look different for every person, but also for every project. So this is a very general positionality statement, but your project may lead you to a different positionality statement because it's talking about very specific things that you may or may not have experience with. So for me, as a Latina who grew up in a working class household, daughter of undocumented immigrants, a first-generation college student, an English language learner, I am motivated to work in the education policy field because of the barriers and lack of opportunities I experienced throughout my education in the U.S. public school system. But I recognize that I cannot separate my life experiences because they have influenced my outlook on the topics I explore in my work. As I continue my research in education policy, it is important for me to recognize the biases and assumptions I may hold because of the negative and positive experiences I have had as a Latina in the U.S. public school system, higher education system, and career post-college. This is a very general positionality statement. And if I was writing about college access, I may tweak it to be more centered around my experiences in college access. If I was writing about literacy, I might tweak it to be more about my experiences in early literacy in the U.S. public school system. But this is what I recommend you always do before you start anything. It's important to think about your position in society and how that relates to your biases and your research and how it's going to influence or not influence it. If you're consuming research and you want to think about the centrality of research, I have questions that I think you should be asking. So if I'm a teacher or if I'm a superintendent or principal and I'm reading a research paper, you should ask, who are the researchers? Kind of like how I put those pictures there so you know who they are. They were 3 men, 2 white men, 1 person of color. What are their backgrounds and how might that influence the way they conduct research and the assumptions they might unwittingly shape the research? Who is funding them? Who do they see as their primary audience of work? Who or what interests decide what questions or issues to research? Was their research agenda influenced by the community? And who is benefiting from asking these questions? That is one question that I always end up asking myself, like, who is benefiting from this research? Because a lot of the times we do research on communities and not with communities, and in the end, they don't seem to be the biggest beneficiaries of the research. The second principle are that numbers are not neutral. And I'm probably speaking to the choir here, but you need to choose your denominator carefully. And this is just good research. In my doctoral program, I was taught to do good research, and good research is to choose your denominator carefully. But if you don't, it could lead to misleading conclusions. So you can present your averages, but it's your responsibility to present a meaningful picture. So in the Fryer study of 2017, it found that U.S. police shoot white, Black, and Latinx individuals whom they have stopped at equal rates. The denominator in their study is everyone whom the police have stopped. The problem is there that being stopped by the police is affected by racial profiling, and there has been evidence that being stopped by the police is affected by racial profiling. Therefore, it's skewing the results because of the number of stops and the higher likelihood that you have to be stopped if you're Black. So thinking about what is your denominator and how that can contribute to the conclusions that you draw, because you're deciding who counts. You're counting and you're deciding who's going to be counted in it. Another one is model selection. Numbers are not neutral. You are choosing your model. Your model will explain how much variation there is, but it will not select the variables for you. You select the variables. And one thing that I've seen a lot is, and I was just taught with best practice, was that socioeconomic status and prior achievement should always be controlled for if you have it, because it's going to control for a lot of variation. You're going to be able to isolate some of that variance. But I think it's really important when you're thinking about your model to make sure that you also run it without these control variables. Because when you control for socioeconomic status, when you control for prior achievement, in some ways, you're controlling for racism. You're controlling away the racism because living in a certain place, means that you have low resource schools, means that students are tracked. It means that they have less experienced teachers with lower expectations because they look a certain way, with fewer role models, among other inhibiting circumstances. So it's important to always think about your model simply so that you don't control away these other variables that people might have experienced racism along the way. And I know it depends on the research question, and I'm probably going to get a lot of questions about this. But I always just encourage people to, do your whole model the way you want it to, but also do it without all the variables. And that way everybody can win and you can really start to dissect and think about your results. So when you're thinking about numbers are not neutral and you are a consumer, again, a teacher, a policymaker, I want you to think about what measure or outcomes were collected. Where were they collected? The geographical location. How? In what format? Was it a telephone? Was it a computer? Because there's going to be biases that lead to each one. Was it in person? When? Is the data relevant? And think about the recruitment. If a community member is the one asking the community, it's probably going to get a different response than if an outsider that doesn't look like them comes and asks questions. So think about who is doing the data collection, who is and is not in the sample. So as a result, some people are in the sample, some people are not. How large is it? Whose perspectives and assumptions were reflected in the analyses? Was the community involved or was it just the researchers? To use the model, it's important to justify your variables. And again, this is just good research. Good research will justify the variables in your model. If averages are reported, what denominator was being used and why? Did they mention a median or do they report a range? Sometimes a median or a range can be more meaningful depending on the type of analysis. In each case, it's just really important to be thinking about all of these questions when you're reading a research project, and that is the second principle, that numbers are not neutral. The third principle are that categories are not neutral. Categories are decided by us, by humans, and they're socially constructed. So it's really important that when researchers are collecting and analyzing data, they need to ensure that their categorization is informed and resonates with the communities of interest. Categories are arbitrary and are embedded in our practices and are biased. They're not objective. If you have too many categories, you can hide inequities, and if you have too few categories, you can hide inequities. So it's this like dance of getting the right amount to make sure that you're giving credit to and unmasking the inequities that exist. So on the right, you can see here I have a table that I created, a bar graph that I created from the U.S. Census. And it's looking at average college enrollment rates from 18 to 24-year-olds by Latinx subgroups. And lately, we've been talking a lot about the fact that Latinx are not a monolith and Asian Americans are not a monolith, that there are nuances that data needs to be disaggregated. And in this case, we have the data because it's U.S. Census, and you can see that South Americans do better in college enrollment than Central Americans and then Caribbean Americans, Latinx people. And you can see here that Central Americans from Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador do disproportionately worse than Costa Rican or Spaniard Hispanics. So looking at these nuances, it can help unpack a lot of different inequities. So for example, if I was in a school in New York and I knew that I had a large Central American population, I might have a different type of college access program than if I was serving a population that looks like mostly South American immigrants. So it's just important to know what the needs are and where the inequities lie. And then the next slide I have is I presented the Asian American one, and you can see here that East Asians do way better in college enrollment rate than South Asians and some Southeast Asians. So you can see that there are differences between them, and it's not okay to lump them all. And I do understand that sometimes we do not have the power or the sample size to do these types of analyses, but when we do have them, it's important to do them. So in places like New York, Chicago, LA, where we have a large population of immigrants, it's important to think about those nuances. And when you're looking at categories and you're looking at a research paper from a practitioner's perspective, you should ask, what are the subgroups that they're analyzing? Do those resonate with your population? Did they separate categories? Sometimes they just present an aggregate. So if they didn't present categories, it's important to present categories. And do they resonate with you, or do you think that they can be broken down in misleading ways? And I think for the Latinx population and for the Asian American population, we can see how disaggregating the data is really important. And when I look at any Latinx data, I'm always thinking about, should this have been broken down? Does it make sense? Did they collect the right data? The fourth principle is that voice and insight, data cannot speak for itself. And I hear a lot people saying, well, the data speaks for itself, and no, it does not. You write the analysis and you write the interpretation and you present it. So you speak for the data. So it's really important. And I was taught this too. I wasn't taught QuantCrit in my doctoral program, but I was taught to be transparent of the limitations of your research. Don't overgeneralize. Make sure you mention that, your samples have limitations, or if you have potential measurement error, or any other potential biases. But it's just also important to, if you have these large confidence intervals, and there are limitations to that and they are inconclusive, but also to present that in a way that a practitioner understands. Because if you just say it's inconclusive because it has a large interval, that's not very useful. So instead, you can explain to them, this is the confidence interval. It is positive leaning, it is negative leaning, this is where it is, and you can decide what to do with that data. But you can also explain the limitations. We don't want to just put all the limitations and then they're like, oh, well, I guess this is not very useful since it has all these limitations. There are results, whether they're null or whether they're positive, and it's just important to present to the practitioner, and then they can decide based on their evidence, from their knowledge and their expertise and their population, if they're going to agree with the study and make recommendations based on the study. It's also important to provide context for your audience. Don't simply say, oh, they were not statistically significant, because that doesn't really mean anything to anybody, but putting them in ways where the audience understands them. So Gordon and Conway suggest, making them like into what is that called? They suggest scaling or translating them into outcomes that we understand. So if you're using binary outcomes, using odd ratios to make it easier, you gain 20% more likely or you're 20% less likely, that's something that people understand. So using odds ratios makes sense. But if you're using continuous data, and this is an approach that I've seen a lot of people do, it's important to say, you gained 3 years of reading level with this intervention. Whoops, that would be a lot. Maybe we should adopt that one. But it's important to put it in terms that people understand. You gain 3 months, you gain 2 months, not you gain 0.45 effect size or 0.067 effect size. That doesn't resonate with the general population. Thinking about days, years, even an SAT test if they're familiar with it, or thinking about it in percentage for odds ratio makes it just more interpretable for people. And when you're reading this as a practitioner, you should say, are the results interpreted in a way that make connections to the experiences of my students, of my parents? Who is your reference group that they're comparing it to? So if you're getting enrollment rates for Chicago, you want to compare it to maybe enrollment rates in another city in Illinois. And are the results practically meaningful? Are they going to do anything for practice, or they're just results for the sake of research and not really going to inform practice? Was there community and youth input? This has been a very big thing of mine, really trying to get youth input and the community involved from the beginning, from the setting of the research agenda, from the setting of the research question, the way it is asked, throughout and towards the end. So for one of the evaluations that I'm working on, we have a alumni from the program being a research assistant because they understand the program, they've been through the program, and they can give us that input all along the way. So that's one way of doing it. You can also have advisory boards. I've seen that done, and advisory boards that are community-based, not just, the big researchers at academic institutions, but having advisory boards that compensate them for their time because they're giving you a lot of valuable information. Again, how is the research being communicated? Make sure that you're using infographics, graphs, not too much academic jargon. As all of you have probably tried, taking out the academic jargon is really, really hard work, and it's probably why it's not done as much. But it's important that we do this hard work, or else our results are not as meaningful as they could be. And then who has access to the results? If it's a peer-reviewed article, it's likely that not a lot of people have access to the results. The last principle that I'm going to go over is a social justice and equity interpretation. And this is when you have your results, you have to interpret them. You as a human, you as a researcher need to interpret them. And it's important to be empathetic, to acknowledge racism, and to be sensitive to ways in which racism might, operate beneath the radar. So one example that I like to always think about is we always see that third grade achievement is related to race. So when you're saying that, it's important to rephrase it and say, third grade achievement is related to racism. So substitute racism for race, because it's not that third grade achievement is related to race. We created the racism that led these students to go to under-resourced schools with lower quality teachers, with lower access to healthcare and other different social supports. So when you're interpreting it, it's important to make sure that you're thinking about race in terms of the systemic racism. So when you're interpreting, you can do little things like that, as well as changing the way the question is phrased by putting the responsibility on the system versus the students. Like, why are Black boys expelled at a higher rate? You can say, what systems have been put in place that have disproportionately expelled white boys? And then lastly, go beyond the existing and overused metrics. This is a recommendation that I say, but I know it's really hard to practice because we all use whatever data we can get. If you can get data, you're going to use it. It doesn't matter if it's good or not. Most of the time, you're just happy you get data. But choosing other metrics that are non-cognitive or that are non-traditional, or creating your own metrics that is particularly sensitive and shaped around the population that you're working with is expensive. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort, and I recognize that. But I think that once we start centering our metrics on the populations that we are serving, and for QuantCrit, it's serving Latinx and Black communities, I think we're going to start to see different results when we start looking at different metrics that are centered differently, that are created differently, that are looking at not only just the test scores, but other types of indicators that we might be interested in. But I acknowledge it's expensive. You don't have the time, and sometimes funders, aren't invested in creating better metrics. So when we are reading a paper, you should always question the researcher's use of language. So how are they framing? Are they using a positive and asset-based perspective? Are there research questions framed in an asset-based perspective? And is the study considering the interpretations and considering racism? Did they make an intentional effort to address their biases? For me, intentions are really important. It's important to be clear and to address them up front. You're not going to have the perfect research paper. No one's ever going to be happy. But if you try to address your blind spots, I think that's really important for my credibility of reading your study. So I wanted to leave time for questions. I did hit the 30-minute mark. I'm proud of myself. So I want to leave time for questions, but before that, did your point of view on quant data change after this presentation? Oh, I forgot the S. And I use Menti for teaching. I think it keeps students engaged, but sometimes all they want to do is answer my polls and not participate in class. So that's also just something to consider. And now we're gonna, as you guys are answering this question, we're gonna open it up for questions in the chat. I wasn't able to follow them.
Hi, Wendy.
Because I was presenting, but yeah.
Here. Hi, guys. I'm Jen Cush with SREE. I'm the Membership and Outreach Coordinator. So, Wendy, we do have, first, thank you so much for your presentation. The Chat is very, very active. We have a couple questions that I can ask you. And then if anyone wants to jump in with additional ones, and everyone on the call, you will get a recording sent out, everyone that's registered for this. And then you'll see in the chat, others have been answering questions. There's been a lot of links to resources being shared. So that's definitely something to look through. So the first question that came, is a positionality statement the same as a reflexivity statement in qualitative?
Well, I think, at least I thought reflexivity statements were also done throughout the process in qualitative research. I may be wrong because this is not my area of expertise. But I think that's something to consider for qualitative researchers, because we don't think about, I am saying you should think about your position before, but maybe it is important to think about your position throughout and how your biases may be affecting the way you do the research throughout.
Thank you. And some of these have probably been answered. Do you recommend one positionality statement per author or a joint statement that reflects the author team?
I like each person doing their own positionality statement, but I also recognize that separate journals have word limits. So I think that that's going to have to be a change in the field to just like allow for a place for everybody to provide their positionality statement, or else I've seen it done both ways, or else we have to be more concise and do a joint one. But I think everyone has individual biases, so it's important to be individual positionality statements. However, I acknowledge that the word count and that the field is not at a place where we have space for it.
How do we reconcile positionality statements with double-blind peer review for journal articles?
Interesting question. Interesting. I've never had that question.
You can take a minute. Or if anyone wants to chime in.
Anybody have any answers to that? Because it wouldn't be double blind at that point. I feel like you can probably, as specific as you can get, you could probably make some good assumptions of who is the author. I'd have to think about that one.
Sure. Regarding categories and names, they're interested in your perspective on APA's guidance on bias-free language, if you're familiar with that at all, and then they did share some links.
I am not familiar with bias-free language. I don't know if you can explain that to me.
Does someone want to come off mute? Ask that.
I like Sarah's suggestion that they can submit the positionality statement after they have been accepted.
Mm.
Wendy, I think the bias-free language comment was about like specific guidelines, instead of like referring to subjects as like men or women, using words like people, individuals. So I think it was guidelines that the APA has around like specific language to use that's more inclusive.
Yeah, I mean, that just sounds like more inclusive language. So for example, when I ask about, I never ask about sex anymore. It's another thing that I do. I ask about gender. So what is your gender? And then I have 3 options, although I recognize that their genders is a spectrum. But now I have 3 options, man, woman, non-binary, for quantitative purposes. I think that's what's working, but even that is not always inclusive because there's a whole spectrum that we're missing out on. So that's the problem with quantitative work, is like trying to be specific enough, but not so specific that then we can't make any type of generalizations or put anybody in groups. But at least for gender, I have been using male, female, non-binary, and I do agree with using the type of pronouns that you just described now.
How do we ensure our data is accessible? There's pressure to publish in peer-reviewed publications, yet we need to make sure it's accessible to our communities. Where do you find that middle ground?
Yeah, I think that's just pull and tug with academia and the field. And I know that the WT grant was funding specific institutions to incentivize people scholars to make their research more accessible, make it more impactful, make it reach communities. So I know the William T. Grant Foundation is trying to do that work. I think if more funders would do that work and, institutions would realize that, hey, maybe it should be based off of, how many people in the field read this paper versus how many people cite it in academic papers. I think that's a field, and it's starting to shift a little bit, especially with that grant, but we have a long way to go.
Catching all the chat, there seems to be a lot back and forth about a position statement, whether it could be accepted by reviewers. A lot of people going back and forth with that. I don't know if you could see the chat, Wendy, of people chiming in. That seems to be the topic.
We also don't just write peer-reviewed articles, right? So we write reports and we write briefs and, smaller memos. So I think that we can include them in all of those. I don't see what the problem is including them in all of those, but I don't see them included in all of those. When it comes to peer-reviewed, I do think it's going to get a little bit more tricky of whether the reviewer should see it or should see it afterwards. But I do think it's important that people who are most affected by the research. So if you're doing research on Black communities and you are a Black scholar, I think it makes sense for you to reveal that. I think it makes, for me at least, it makes your research, I feel like you have a different insight, and I want to see what it is in the positionality statement. And if you don't have that insight, I want to see that you acknowledge that you don't have that insight in a positionality statement. But I don't know if the whole field would agree with me when they're reviewing the paper and reading those positionality statements. So I could see the benefit of doing it afterwards. But
great. Sarah, you had just posted about this. Do you want to chime in?
Sorry, Jen,
yes,
you know
Sarah.
that I'm an abuser of the chat when it is
Sarah,
made available to me.
You go for it.
I also, and I think, and I hope I'm pronouncing this person's name correctly, that Akua and I are,
did we lose Sarah or did I just lose her?
that like a lot of what, did you lose me?
I think you're breaking up a little bit.
Is this better? Am I here? Okay,
yep.
Sorry. Someone is showing my house, so I was sitting outside for a moment. What I was saying, I think there are a few of us who are maybe converging on this in the chat, but I think an important thing to also reflect on is that research itself is a political project. And a lot of questions people are bringing up right now are actually broader questions about this political project. So when I'm thinking about questions on like publishing and accessibility, to me, that's more a question of who are we doing research for? Why are we doing research, and what is the goal? And one of the things that I find really powerful about operating from a QuantCrit perspective is to be able to recognize the liberatory power in research, and that you can do research to emancipate people. And like, I don't know, I approach the work from the perspective of my goal is to not have to do this research anymore. I would love to just like not have this job. But so anyways, I do think that like QuantCrit makes explicit the political project, and part of it is really naming that. And like, I hope this challenges people to leave and think about what political project they've been operating under right now. You may feel like you're not, but you are.
And I feel like you can frame all of these principles without saying critical race theory as well. And I think that might be more palatable for certain audiences. However, critical race theory and QuantCrit is putting race at the center of it all. So the purpose is to center race. But you can go around it, and I keep going back and forth depending on the audience that I'm speaking to about like which framing I want to use. So I want to stay true to myself and my beliefs, which are that like race is the center. Or do I want to, so I go back and forth, and I'd like to hear people's opinions on that. And somebody asked a question that you can do work about systemic inequities that are not considered QuantCrit. Yeah, you can. Like, for example, if you're not considering your position, if you're, the way you're asking your question is deficit-based, if you're not thinking about getting community members, if you're not disaggregating data where it should be disaggregated, you could uncover, you still can uncover systemic inequities, but you're not taking this perspective where you're like, I'm going to make this accessible. I'm going to get people involved from the community. I'm going to try to do it differently. I'm going to be careful about my denominator. You did your research in the traditional way and you found inequities. Any other questions that you see, Jen?
I don't think so. I think we covered everything asked earlier.
Somebody asked Raiden, I love the idea of replacing race with racism. How do you walk this line between careful about assuming causality? So I would say is related to, racism is related to third grade achievement. I wouldn't say racism, I never try to use effects or impacts or, causes. I always just try to use is related to, is associated with, is correlated with, though I just try to use the more correlational, relational language. I do think that somebody asked about the open science movement. I do think that the open science movement, that's part of like democratizing data, which is a lot of what the WT Grant Foundation does, is they're trying to democratize data, make research, democratize research, make research more accessible. And that does go with the idea and the principles of QuantCrit because it's more accessible to people and people can understand it. So it's this idea of democratizing research, democratizing data. And I think QuantCrit is just doing it in a way that places racism and race at the forefront. That's how it's different from other, you might have heard of other types of ways of looking at data more equitably, looking at data in ways that are more true or however you want to say it. But QuantCrit is just saying, let's put race at the center of it and then let's talk about data. That's the difference. Yeah, and as you know, I am not on the tenure track, so I have the liberty to do the research and the work, not constrained by the fact that I have to do peer-reviewed articles, and that's a choice that I made. So I understand that that's the way the system works. I decided not to do it, lead my career in that way. So I am able to do equitable evaluation, and you could still do it if you're on tenure track, but it's just a little bit easier since I do not have to constrain myself to the peer-reviewed articles only. So I did submit this to a peer-reviewed article because that is how the world works. Some people are talking about YPAR, youth participatory action research. QuantCrit is advocating for that. It is advocating to include youth, to make them part of the process, especially since they're the most impacted by the actual research that we do in education, for example. Letitia, do you have a question that you want to ask?
Hi, Wendy. Yes, there was a question that had come up in the chat earlier, and I wanted to add to it. It was a question specifically thinking about the blind review process and writing a positionality statement. And my addition to that is thinking about myself as a scholar of color and how my work is viewed and judged by reviewers. And I'm wondering if you have any commentary on that in including a positionality statement, because I just wanted to offer some context, which is why I raised my hand rather than posting in the chat, because I think it would be very beneficial for reviewers to know the positionality of scholars prior to reading the paper in terms of the review process, right? So if I am reading a paper on, let's say, interracial adoption, and the scholar who wrote the paper, has a transracial adoptee, that would be really helpful to know as we're reading through the paper. But let's say I'm writing a paper about Black parenting stress and racism, and I'm speaking from that position as a woman of color. What does that do for my paper going through journals that are founded in very similar ways to our universities as these white supremacist institutions? So I was just wondering if you could offer some commentary on that along with the blind process.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I would say that when I read something, so if I'm reading something and it's a Black author about Black students, I do like affirmative action, Wendy style. Like, to me, that I feel like journal articles should start doing some type of affirmative action in the way of like, this makes them more credible because they have experienced it and lived it, and that's valuable. And we don't value that. So I think journal articles if we were to do positionality statements, I think they would have to do some sort of leg up to counteract the biases that you would have as a woman of color, like, because they have biases against women of color that, we don't write as well, or we're not rigorous enough. So I think they would have to do something like that if they were to read that positionality statement. Like, for me, it would be really helpful, but not everybody is like me. So I think that's where it goes back to maybe it should be done after the fact. But in that case, if it's done after the fact, you're not able to really understand the rigorous, to me, doing positionality statement is being rigorous. You're not able to understand the whole rigorous process that the scholar went through. You're just like sort of checking the box of, oh, after they did do it, check. So this is something to still think about, and I will be thinking about it. And hopefully, in my next talk, I have a better answer, because I get different questions and they keep pushing me, and I love it. So like next time I have better answers. One of the questions that I've gotten before is like, isn't this just like good research? And I'm like, yes, it is just good research, but it's just being very intentional and explicitly verbalizing and naming that systemic racism exists in this world of numbers.
Thank you. This has been a great workshop. Thank you.
Well, thanks everybody so much. I love ending early too. So, and if you want to contact me, you can email me. Feel free to email me, and feel free to follow me on Twitter, WCastillo-PhD. I love Twitter. I learned so much from Twitter. I highly recommend. Twitter actually pushes my thinking. So,
before we sign off, I'm just going to, Robert, you have shared some NSF programs and such, and I didn't know if you wanted to share those verbally. If he's still here. Okay, Robert shared.
I can chime
Okay, go ahead.
I'm from the NSF as well. So we have a new program solicitation out, not solicitation, a new program description about racial equity in STEM education. And there is a due date July 13th, and October something is the second due date. Bob Russell put a link in the chat to it, so do save your chat. And then we also have several other, most of our programs in the Division of Research on Learning are very interested in approaches similar to what Wendy's been sharing. So please bring your QuantCrit ideas our way. Was there anything else Bob put in?
Just to serve on peer review panels.
Oh my goodness. That would be amazing. Thank you, Ellen. Yes, please feel free to email any of us. I will put my email in the chat right now if I can find it. But feel free to email any of us. I think serving on a review panel is not only incredibly fun and intellectually engaging, but also much needed to get who's in the room helps decide where the funding goes. So it's very, very important who's in the room. And it also gives everyone who does it gets a really good experience of what the review conversations look like and sound like, and what proposals look like when they address all of the questions and when they still have more work to do. So it's a really excellent opportunity, and we need you.
Thank you. And I see a hand from Akua.
Yes.
Yeah, Akuya.
Akuya, thank you.
Yes, and thank you for the presentation. I just wanted to, because we've talked a little bit around positionality and journal article submissions, I just wanted to uplift again that, you know, at least for me, a positionality statement is not just about listing your identities. I think in that context, I can see how it makes sense to submit afterwards, but a positionality statement, at least in its original intent that I understand it to be, is meant to be about listing your perspective. And so, for example, the person who developed the theory around Black students having oppositional defiant disorder was a Black person. So that, you know, the identity in and of itself does not tell you anything. And so I also don't want people to lean into identitarianism and, you know, wanting to just kind of use that as a placeholder for actually explaining your theoretical perspective, because unfortunately quant papers oftentimes don't have a strong theoretical framework, if they even do include that. So the positionality statement is not about just saying, I am a Black queer person, you know, from Ghana. That doesn't tell you anything, because they're Ghanaian people who were pro-colonialism, who are anti-Black and all of these things. But it helps more to say that I see racism as endemic, that the disciplinary system was created to harm Black students, that I believe that police are, you know, a relic / a current iteration of slave patrollers, right? Like all of that can then tell you why in my research, when I talk about SROs on campus, this is how I talk about them. And also for people who, I guess another thing that I feel like people need to contend with is that if your positionality statement might undermine your work, potentially you need to reconsider your work. Like it's not, if you think listing your identity as a white person is going to harm the work, maybe that solicitation call was actually meant to increase the presence of people of color in research spaces. So if you think exposing that is going to put you at a disadvantage, maybe find somewhere else to submit your work, maybe find somewhere that, you know, I guess whatever your positionality is isn't going to affect it. But this has been really informative to hear other perspectives on how to use positionality statements and just QuantCrit. So thanks.
Thank you. No, I really appreciate that perspective. And I will definitely take that into consideration. I definitely think it's more than just like, hey, I'm a Latina, you know, only because you're brown doesn't mean you're down.
We have another question. You can, is it Adi?
Yes, Adi.
Adi, go ahead.
Thank you. I really appreciate these points. They're super helpful. And I was wondering, what are ways that we can show through positionality or reflexivity statements that we have considered our own biases or ways that we are addressing them? For context, I'm often a white researcher going to other countries and doing international development work. So, you know, we always try to hire local consultants and get local advice, but I would really love any thoughts on how to think through doing this and what I would put in such a statement.
Yeah, I think it's also about your team and how they're pushing you. I have had the privilege to work with people who are always pushing my thinking, and they're like, oh, Wendy, like, have you considered that bias that you may have? For example, if you are not a first generation college student and you're doing college access work, what are the different biases that could go into place? Like, you know, just thinking about, you don't understand the experience of people and the information that is given at schools. You don't understand the family culture that different backgrounds may have into how college access choices are made. Thinking about all of those things and trying to really think beyond what you know, like what don't you know? And then when you're doing the research, going back to those things that you don't know and thinking about, well, maybe in Latino cultures, it's, you know, people don't go too far away from college because it's important to stay closer to your family. So maybe, you know, when you're talking about college access, it's important to think about options that are close by. Those types of things are the things that I'm thinking about. And also when you're analyzing your data, to put that into context, to ask those questions and go get the answers and put them in the context. that's what I think the
sort of
positionality
qualitative
would do.
work, like with focus groups and interviews, and the ways that you address the lack of data that you come with.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Is there anyone else?